Hey everybody, we're back. We're going to go through and do a demonstration on the temperature gauge now to make sure that it's functional before we get installed into the Jeep. In fact, later on, after it's installed, we can use our little our demonstration board to verify some other things are not points of failure, such as wiring or even the sending units that are installed in the Jeep. So let's take a look at this. So I have the gauge hooked up. So if you'll remember from our wiring diagram, we'll pull that up, that the temperature gauge requires a 5-volt power, as well as the sending unit wire going down to the temperature temp sensor. Now in this case we're going to use the rheostat that we walked through to simulate our temp sensor, so we can adjust it to a known resistance, or an aka a known temperature, to make sure that the gauge is properly working. Later on, again, we could verify that the temp sensor is working and things of that nature, but let's kind of take a look at this. Before we do, remember that we should be reading a resistance of roughly 19 to 21 ohms from the 2 points. So if we'll look at that for just a second, I'll go ahead. I've got one lead already touched, connected. So as we do that, we should read right around 21 ohms or so. So the gauge is good. We went ahead and verified that. So as far as how we have this wired up to our demonstration board, we have 3 wires ran to it. The first one we have is a ground wire. And again, I'm not certain that this is actually required on the temperature gauge, but we do have a ground wired back to our terminal strip here. We have a 5-volt power supply going back from our converter, so that 5 volts is coming into point A on the temperature temperature gauge. Then we have the sending unit wire, which is going back to basically our temp sensor, aka the rheostat. So we walked through the wiring of that a little while ago. So that's all done. I currently have it dialed in. Right now you'll see roughly 73 ohms. So I don't have power hooked up to this, and I'll go ahead and do that. So give me a second. Okay, so I have power connected to our external voltage regulator. So we should have 12 volts coming in, and if I check it, I actually will. I should have 12 volts here if I measure from the positive to the negative here, and I should have 5 volts from this positive to the negative here. So once I do that, once I hook power up, this guy is live, assuming I've got everything else hooked up and I didn't miss a ground. If I miss a ground, I'll burn it up. So again, we are reading cold on the gauge, and we are dialed in at 73 ohms. So the according to everything online, hot is roughly 9 ohms, and everything in between is everything in between hot and cold. So let's kind of dial it into what they call the beginning of the band, which is like 36 degrees or 36 ohms according to online, and we should start to see this guy move. It is slow, it does take a little while, but you can see that we are slowly moving. So this demonstrates that this gauge is actually functional, not a bad gauge. You do this to one straight out of the box, just to make sure it's working before you crawl up underneath your dash and install it. So it's looking like it's slowing down. So roughly 13 ohms is towards the end of the temperature band according to everything online. So I'm going to come back up here, and I'm going to dial this into what I have marked as 13 ohms. So we should see this continue to move. So you can see we're continuing to move. And 13 ohms is the end of the band. 9 ohms is full hot. So should be pretty close, if not to full hot, by the time this quits moving. Yeah. So I think that's about right. That's what we expect. Again, I've had this one apart a few times, so the needle might be slightly more hot than what you would necessarily expect. And if I go ahead and adjust this to full hot, you can see that the needle at least keeps moving until we hit the stop on the gauge. So that right there should demonstrate that we have a fully functional temperature gauge. This one's pretty simple because it requires just that 5-volt input. We're going to take a look at the temperature or the fuel gauge here in a second, which has those 3 inputs. But we're going to try to simplify it down just as simple as this guy right here. So hopefully if there's any questions, let me know. Oh, hey, before we go, let's go ahead and just dial it back down just to see this go. So if we go back down to, we won't even go full cold, we'll just go somewhere a little bit less than the 73 ohms, and we should see this guy start to swing back. Just for fun. There we go. Alright guys, thanks.